Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Kennedy, and the focus is life in the White House, and the second year begins. The year is 1961. It's kind of coming to the end of a pretty rough first year of the presidency for John Kennedy, and it was also a time of personal adjustments for him, for his family, and the most serious took place on December the 19th when his 73-year-old father, Joe Kennedy, suffered a stroke, a massive stroke, leaving him paralyzed on the right side. He was unable to speak. The president flew down to be with his father. His father didn't even recognize him for the first couple of days. This was going to be devastating for the entire family. Now, Joe Kennedy would actually outlive his son by several years, but the family patriarch would frankly never be the same again. In terms of Kennedy's health, well, of course, it had never been very good. Constant pain throughout much of his life, and that persisted into his presidency. In fact, sometimes he would even have to get around on crutches because of the pain in his back. Dr. Janet Travell was the White House physician, and she had actually been with him since he had his back surgery back in 1954. And one of the things that she brought to the table was Procaine, this anesthetic that she would inject into his lower back, and all of a sudden the pain would kind of disappear. The problem is it was always very temporary. So now as president, John Kennedy was getting from Dr. Travell 2, sometimes 3 Procaine shots a day to try to alleviate the pain. She was also administering, by the way, cortisone, steroids to treat his Addison's disease, because for Kennedy, if it wasn't one thing, it was another. The problem with the steroids is they actually caused more deterioration in his back. He kind of couldn't win, but he was just trying to treat all this pain. Another element was Dr. Max Jacobson. They called him Dr. Feelgood, and he had joined during the 1960 campaign, the Kennedy team, and he had been famous for kind of helping celebrities who were exhausted. So what did he do? Well, he'd give them an injection. It would kind of be an immediate pick-me-up, and the same worked for John Kennedy. And they really weren't even sure what was in these injections, some kind of combination of amphetamines and painkillers, and sometimes it would leave the president a little bit groggy, but again, anything to reduce the pain so he could focus on the work. Well, he was struggling still physically in 1961. He was using his rocking chair in the Oval Office. That seemed to give a little bit of relief. He was taking his pills, taking the shots. But then in October of 61, another doctor came into the mix, Hans Kraus. He's an orthopedic surgeon and a specialist in physical therapy. And he said, Mr. President, we have to add something to your routine. Exercise, calisthenics, heat therapy. This combination, which they started administering just about every day to the president, actually seemed to have a real impact. His doctors felt in February of 1962 he was physically as good as he had been since the campaign. Again, never great, but at least he was better, and the pain was being managed a little bit better than it had been. Kennedy was working hard as president all day, every day during the week in particular. He would be in meetings, on calls, meet with his cabinet secretaries. He would meet with his staff, members of Congress, giving his televised press conferences, the New Frontier agenda. He was trying to push hard, maximizing every minute, just like he had tried to do his entire life. That was for both for work and also for the social side, which typically came out in the evenings and primarily on weekends when Kennedy would get away from the White House. Oftentimes they would go off to Glen Ora, this house that they were renting in Northern Virginia, to get away from the White House, or up to Camp David, or down to Palm Beach, Florida, or the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, just to get away. Again, still a little bit of work sometimes, but also it would be for fun. He would have family around. He would have friends like Lem Billings, one of his buddies, or George Smathers, or others, and there were also plenty of girls. John Kennedy's womanizing did not stop when he got married. It did not stop when he became president of the United States. Many of these were simply one-night stands, but there were also things that were bordering on a relationship or an affair, like with Pamela Turnure, who was the First Lady's press secretary, was involved a bit with John Kennedy. Priscilla Ware and Jill Cowan were in the mix. They were called affectionately Fiddle and Faddle during their jobs and tenure in the West Wing. Maybe the closest to a relationship outside of his marriage was with Mary Pinchot Meyer, who was the sister-in-law of Ben Bradlee, who got to be quite close with Kennedy. And then there were the movie starlets that also continued to find find the way to Kennedy's bed. Jean Tierney, Arlene, Dahl, Jane Mansfield, Marlene, Dietrich, and of course the rumors about the sex symbol of them all in that era, Marilyn Monroe, particularly after Monroe sang Happy Birthday to Mr. President at Madison Square Garden to celebrate his birthday in May of 1962. The rumors of a tryst with Marilyn Monroe also circulated as well. So what did the First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy do about all of this? How did she handle it? Well, mostly she just tried to ignore it. She knew she couldn't stop the behavior, but sometimes it got to be a bit much. Like when she was about to shake hands in a receiving line with a woman that she knew was sleeping with her husband. When she saw this woman, she turned around to Dave Powers, one of Kennedy's aides, and said, "Isn't it bad enough that you solicit this woman for my husband, but then you insult me by asking me to shake her hand?" Kennedy, or rather Jacqueline Kennedy, really tried to focus in her mind on her primary role, which was, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm not a public official, she said. I'll always do anything my husband asks me to do, but I think the major role of the First Lady is to take care of the president, and if you bungle raising your children, I don't think whatever else you do well matters very much. She wanted no role in the politics of things. In terms of her own mission, something important to her probably would be the White House and the arts. The White House had been fully renovated. The infrastructure had been fully renovated during the Harry Truman administration not too long before. Jacqueline Kennedy, though, focused on the inside with the furniture and the artifacts, trying to restore a lot of that to its original state, make more of a museum piece out of the White House, a sense of American history being captured in the president's home. And she worked with some of her closest friends like Henry DuPont and Rachel Mellon, known as Bunny, Stephane Boudin, who helped her redo some of the key rooms in the executive mansion. It also added to the Rose Garden, and this was a particular area of interest for John Kennedy. He wanted this to be done just right, also working with Bunny Mellon on that. Jacqueline Kennedy helped put together a White House guidebook published by the new White House Historical Association that she established and still exists today. All of these things were very popular, but none was so popular as what Jacqueline Kennedy did in February of 1962 when she went on national television for a tour of this renovated White House. It was a huge hit. 56 million Americans tuned in for Jacqueline Kennedy's tour of the White House. She was bringing grace and glamour back to the White House. They were holding white tie events for visiting politicians, heads of state. Artists were performing like Pablo Casals. Press coverage was great. The public adored it. Great asset for John Kennedy politically was his wife, and again the glamour side of the Kennedy administration, which was really a treat for many of the people in the American public. As Kennedy opened year 2 of his administration, he got off with his second State of the Union address, his focus on both national security and the American economy. He believed still in trying to get America moving again like he had talked about in the campaign. Things were a little better economically than when he first inherited. Unemployment had finally dropped a little bit below 6%. Inflation was hovering very low at around 1%, but Kennedy was worried about growth and he was worried about prices and inflation. He worried in particular about upcoming contract negotiations between labor and management and kind of had a warning for them all. Don't be greedy. Kennedy said our first line of defense against inflation is the good sense and public spirit of business and labor, keeping their total increases in wages and profits in step with productivity. I strongly urge them, management and labor, for their country's interest and for their own, to apply the test of public interest to these transactions and upcoming contract negotiations. The major focus for the Kennedy administration, steel. Steel was everywhere throughout the American economy, and he was worried about a spike in steel prices could impact prices elsewhere. So he had Labor Secretary Arthur Goldberg work very closely with steel, both management and labor, trying to appeal to their patriotism, and the workers seemed to be aligned. The administration was thrilled when the workers agreed to a new contract. No wage increase at all. They did secure a handful of other benefits, but wages were really the key, because if they kept wages in check, then the owners, management should have no reason to raise prices. It would be a win for America. Well, surprise happened. April the 10th. 5:45 p.m., this pop-up item had fit onto Kennedy's schedule when Roger Blough, the chairman of U.S. Steel, requested a late meeting. Came to see the president and he told him flat out, Mr. President, in just a few minutes, U.S. Steel is going to issue a press release. We're raising prices by 3.5%, and it looks like everybody else in steel is going to go along with this. Well, Kennedy was angry at Blough. He said to him, you have made a terrible mistake. You double-crossed me after the administration had worked so hard to keep wages down with the workers. To have this, he felt like it was a betrayal, and he was determined to fight it. Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, got a call and said, look, I want to investigate these folks. Antitrust. How is it possible that all of these companies are going to raise prices the same amount at the same time? There's got to be collusion going on, some kind of price fixing. I want to look into that. And let's make it personal. Let's go look after the personal expense accounts of these steel executives. Let's get the IRS involved. Maybe that'll wake these people up. Well, Bobby Kennedy said, so all of them were hit with meetings the next morning by agents. All of them were subpoenaed for their personal records. I agree it was a tough way to operate, but under the circumstances, we couldn't afford to lose. John Kennedy then went on the bully pulpit of the presidency. He gave a public speech on television decrying this move by the steel industry executives. The pressure campaign was actually working. After a few days, a couple of the smaller steel companies backed away from the price increase. Then Bethlehem Steel, the #2 steel producer in the country, also said, we're going back to the old prices. The only one left was U.S. Steel. Eventually, they repealed as well. A huge win for Kennedy and his administration. He said, if I had failed to get a rescission, that would have been an awful setback to the office of the presidency. It was one of the reasons why he fought it so hard and, in fact, enhanced the power of the presidency by winning on this case. His real focus primarily during this period on the economics was on what was called the Trade Expansion Bill, which would give the president authority to lower tariffs by up to 50% with their European trading partners over the course of 5 years. According to Kennedy, that the bill was the most important international piece of legislation affecting economics since the Marshall Plan. It gave him a lot of authority, and it would be used just not as much by him. This would have a pretty significant positive impact on the economy, but more so by his successor. Sometimes these things, in trying to fight for the new frontier, they would come along, but they would come along rather slowly. Even more slowly, though, was what was happening in civil rights, where Kennedy continued to be cautious. He was worried about the Southern voters in Congress, that if he went too far on civil rights, they would abandon his entire new frontier agenda. So again, he moved slowly. And this was noticed by civil rights activists like Martin Luther King Jr., who said he wished that the president could do more in the area of moral persuasion by occasionally speaking out against segregation, counseling the nation on the moral aspects of this problem. But that's not really what Kennedy was doing. But he was about to be confronted with an issue that he did take action on. Just like his predecessor, Dwight Eisenhower, who had to bring in troops to help with the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, per a court order, John Kennedy was about to face the similar situation in the state of Mississippi at the university level. It revolved around James Meredith, a black man in his late 20s who had been inspired by Kennedy's inaugural address. What could he do for his country? Apply to the all-white University of Mississippi and break that color barrier. Well, he did, and the court sided with him. They insisted that Meredith be admitted per decisions by the Supreme Court and now carried through. But the governor of Mississippi was completely balking at this. Ross Barnett literally standing in the way of James Meredith being able to register in Mississippi. Barnett was promising not to surrender to the evil and legal forces of tyranny. We must either submit to the unlawful dictates of the federal government or stand up like men and tell them never. Barnett basically telling that to the President of the United States, John Kennedy. Well, Kennedy was bound, like Eisenhower, to enforce the orders of the courts, and so he started applying federal marshals. Up to about 500 of them showed up in Oxford, Mississippi to help James Meredith get underway in his college career. Well, Barnett responded by using the state guard to block the entrance. There were local politicians and a local mob. This could get ugly, it could get violent, and Barnett was actually at that point held in contempt of court. He was ordered to comply by October 1st to have James Meredith registered within the university, and he continued to fight it. In fact, on October the 1st, there was a riot. 160 of those marshals were injured, 27 of them by bullet wounds, and 2 people were killed in this riot. John Kennedy and his administration, they were monitoring this by the minute, and John Kennedy was angry because he had already anticipated something like this, and he told the Army, the U.S. Army, to have people in place ready to go in case they were needed, and they were stationed not far away in Memphis, Tennessee, and it seemed like it took them all night to finally arrive, and a lot of that violence that took place in Oxford had already passed, and Kennedy was not happy with the Army over this. He was pleased, though, that stability did return. Up to about 20,000 troops showed up, and that brought that stability. And sure enough, it was James Meredith who was admitted finally into the University of Mississippi, one of the last, not the last, but one of the last universities to finally be integrated in the United States. This was part of the maturation process for John Kennedy, according to Arthur Schlesinger, who is now on his staff as White House historian. Schlesinger said that the Kennedys began to understand how profoundly the Republic had been trapped by its history after what they had gone through at the University of Mississippi. The path to the new frontier was not easy for John Kennedy, whether it was the economy, civil rights. He knew he needed to fight. He needed the political courage to kind of push through some of the obstinance. He had some success to date. It was a little bit slow going at times as well, but his ideas were starting to finally kick in. Maybe he's going to have more progress coming up in this second and third year of his administration, but those are stories for another day. That is John Kennedy, Life in the White House, and the second year begins. From the life of John Kennedy. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.